When the assassin fired the shot that killed the Reverend Martin Luther King, he might have killed, if his aim had been a few inches off, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, or for that matter, the Reverend Abernathy, who was also Dr. King's side. It was Mr. Abernathy who officially succeeded Martin Luther King as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but it is to Jesse Jackson that most people increasingly look for leadership in the black civil rights movement. Mr. Jackson is from North Carolina, of a poor family. He distinguished himself early by mastering a job that had him ordering other men around at the age of 11. He was scouted by the professional football and baseball clubs, went for a year to the University of Illinois, then to North Carolina's Agricultural and Technical College, from which he graduated with honors, while engaging actively in the civil rights sit-ins of the 60s. In 1965, he decided to go to a seminary from which he was ordained a Baptist minister in 1968. He is the head of Operation Breadbasket, which operates out of Chicago and seeks to rally black support for black business, and seeks by persuasion, cajolery, and boycott to force black serving enterprises in Chicago and elsewhere to hire black personnel and to patronize black establishments. Mr. Jackson is labeled a moderate by those who view the civil rights movement with some detachment. Those who have heard him speak, for instance, at the famous Saturday morning sessions of Operation Breadbasket, find the word inadequate to describe his special mixture of evangelism, toughness, eloquence, and bombast. There are those who consider him the most galvanizing orator on the American scene. I should like to begin by getting a little perspective on the problem by asking Mr. Jackson whether he believes that there is another country in which a Negro minority of the size of our own would have a better chance of achieving equality with the American white man.
Well, a couple of things. I would like to make a couple of corrections. One, I'm from South Carolina. Greenville, South Carolina, as opposed to North Carolina.
Sorry.
Secondly, we could better communicate by using black at this point in time in history. Secondly, the American black man is best suited here because this is home to him. Any place else is foreign to us. Now, it is true that we have some need and some responsibility really to relate to the country of our roots, just as the other ethnic groups that are here transplanted. But we are better suited here than any other place on earth, really.
Now that much is obvious to me, at least. What is not obvious to me from some of the criticisms of America that are made is whether you consider that the mobility in America is best suited for the advancement of minorities, or whether the mobility in other kinds of societies is better, and if so, in which societies, and what is the profile?
Well, number one, I don't have too much experience in other societies. I have only lived under this one for the most part, and I've read some other things about other societies, but I don't trust my reading too much because I can't trust reading periodicals even here at home. Now, the issue is whether or not a minority can have mobility in this society at all. And we have mobility as a people in proportion to the humanity of the majority. For example, we were ready to play baseball before 1947, but the mind of the American white male was not willing to accept us as a person in the athletic arena before 1947. We were ready to sit on the front of a bus before 1956, but the American male's mind was not ready. We were ready to vote before 1965. So in some real sense, our growth within the context of being a military minority and a numerical minority, and certainly an economic minority, is almost in proportion to the humanizing process that takes place in the white mind. I think that the thing that is the issue now, I mean, in terms of just ethnic breakdown, is that black people in America, we are the minority when one uses a strict black-white breakdown. But there are numerically more blacks than Irish, or Italian, or Jews, or Germans. So in some sense, we are a majority minority. And to that extent, we are not, say, as impotent because of our numerical strength, say, as the Indian or some other minorities, even within the context of this very confused scene would be.
Mm. Well, you're edging in the direction that I am going to encourage you to move in the next few minutes, namely, what ought to be done. But I'm very interested, before we get there, to see whether or not you find in America certain structural problems which are not present elsewhere. Now, you say that you can't trust the periodicals of other countries sufficiently to allow you to make a first-hand judgment. I don't ask for first-hand judgment.
Periodicals of this country.
Yeah.
In other words, if I pick up today's newspaper and consider that as representative of the events that happened yesterday, I'm living in Chicago, you see, and if I read the major white papers in the morning, and I compare that account of what happened yesterday in Chicago as compared with the community I come from, which is about 40% of Chicago, it looks as if either the white paper or the black community is anachronistic one to the other. There is hardly any relationship. So I can't just trust what I read because that's not always the most accurate evidence of what happened yesterday. And so based upon that level of that degree of inaccuracy, it's very difficult to just read about what you think is happening in Russia, what you think is happening in Asia. So I can operate within the context of my experiences, which are limited, and they're limited basically to the American experience. I've been to Africa, and I've been down in the islands. I've seen a few things here and there, but certainly not at sufficient depth to be able to give any comparative analysis. So I would have to give expressions of what I see based upon basically my American experience, and I would have to compare my relative ability to grow with my American white counterpart, or other black counterparts for that matter.
Fair enough. So that we know that we all had better be suspicious, I certainly am, of what we know about other countries if we rely exclusively on the press or on tendentious reporting. But leaving aside the fact that neither of us, let's say, has first-hand knowledge of all other societies in the world, what modifications in our own society ought, in your judgment, to be made, again, of a structural sort, which have been made elsewhere? For instance, you mentioned the Jim Crow of 1967, the voting reform of 1965, there is a tissue of civil rights legislation, which obviously you approve of. Certain other societies perhaps were more advanced than our own in forwarding such legislation. Now, are you aware of a society that has moved even further in the direction that you think we ought to move in, which we ought to emulate?
What I think is happening is that, in doing background information on me, what I need to make clear, is that I'm, not an international expert, not even a good national. I'm basically just a country preacher. So there's a lot of things I don't know. So I'm going to just deal with what I know. So I have to stay on what I've experienced. And I have to compare, since most things, everything social is relative, I have to compare our relative progress based upon the circumstance out of which we came. For example, from 55 to 64, we were in an out-and-out struggle to fight public humiliation simply based upon skin color. We had to sit in the back of the bus and couldn't use public facilities, the parks, the libraries, based simply upon skin color, and that was humiliating, and this society could not afford that level of sickness from its majority, and the minority could no longer accept that level of oppression. And so the Comprehensive Public Accommodations Bill literally broke up that particular phenomenon at the very formal level, and we moved on to another phase. And so there's a greater interrelationship now between persons in this country than ever before. Then from 64 to 66, really, we fought in the political arena. climaxed in the Selma movement and began to move toward fighting for participation in the democracy. And since that time, we have gone from 3 black congressmen to 13, from about 400 elected officials to about 2,100, and no black mayors to about 84. And so that has been rapid political progress, and needless to say, we can talk about what I see as some solutions later on. But the fact is, we have grown in proportion to the pressure applied by the upsurge in blacks and by the realization of our humanity by enlightened whites. Now, that has basically been the pattern of our social progress.
Well, now, is this a pattern which argues that argues against the wisdom of revolutionary manifestations? Is the very fact that as much progress has been made as you have pointed to testimony to the flexibility of the American system and its general hospitality to what it is that you desire to achieve?
Well, it appears to be more hostile to change than hospitable. However, I'm not sure that phenomenon is any different any place else than here. People in power tend to be hostile to change. Parents tend to be hostile to change. I mean, everything tends to be hostile to change, and the fact is either you change or you bust or you die. Now, what is beginning to happen, as I see it, is that we have fought a battle within the context of a country that, let me put it, the thing that's most disappointing about America is that America has the potential to be the greatest country in the history of the world. The question is, how soon will this country actualize her potential? So I think I spend more time comparing America with what America is over and against what America ought to be as compared to comparing the country with other countries or even other ideologies. I just see this country wasting too much natural and human resources. I see too many people that have the basic potential to be producers who are trapped in school systems that leave them only being consumers. Persons I see who have the desire and the potential to be developers and builders end up on welfare. Persons who have the ability to feed people by being productive persons end up having to beg for food stamps. So one has to deal with America in one sense within the context of her potentiality over and against what she's actually doing, inasmuch as one cannot speak of America apart from the investment that the many peoples of America have already invested. I, for one, am not willing to leave the country basically because I think that my foreparents have put too substantial an investment in this country for me to walk away and try to start from another base where I don't have any particular investment in.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I would like now to ask you, in terms of the emphases that you have made in the last several years, you've been quoted frequently, for instance, in believing that the black man ought to assert himself more vigorously in trying to participate in the productive mechanisms of the country. At the same time, the word black capitalism seems to be in disrepute. And I read somewhere that you said that if, in fact, the black people acquired capitalism and accepted white values, then you would think that that was counterproductive. Can you explain to me what you meant by that?
Well, I'll explain it in 2 parts. One is that given the significance of symbolism and words as a phenomenon, black people under the general heading of capitalism have experienced slavery and all the other shades of degradation between slavery and actual chattel slavery and where we are now. So there's a basic reaction to the word capitalism by people who feel trapped at the bottom of the economy. So when we talk about self-development, self-determination in the black community, there's a rather positive taste left in people's mouths. When one talk about capitalism, people say we don't want to deal with the system that has suppressed folks and us out. So we tend not to use the terminology. I think that is significant. The second thing is that there is such a great spirit in this country for competition as opposed to cooperation at some very vital areas, until we end up, you know, with a relative few people owning the most, not because they worked the hardest, but because they got in at the base of the system and the provision was not provided for other people to be involved in the system. The tragedy is, we are, from my perspective, we are the most overproductive world economically in the history of the world, and yet in the face of that, a nation of only 200 million, as opposed to China's 800 million, we still have 40 million people who are listed as malnourished. And of that 40 million listed as malnourished, 28 million are white, which is contrary to the journal information. Of the 14 million rural poor, 11 million are white. And of that 40 million, 30 million live in a household where somebody is working every day, except they make such little money until they're working. Apparently does not mean very much, because they do not, their person is not respected. And to that extent, the system has failed, because it has failed to inspire people to work. It has failed to feed, even though its agricultural system is overproductive. It has failed to house people, even though it has the capacity to house people. At that level, there's something morally degenerate about the system that has the ability to deal with man's basic problems of poverty, ignorance, and disease, but does not have the will to do it. Where you find a lot of persons going to medical school, and they're more concerned about personal wealth than public health. A lot will go to law school, and they're more concerned about a judgeship than genuinely distributing justice. A lot of others will go to school to teach, and they'll be more concerned about teaching for pay, out and out, more concerned about teaching for a living, so to speak, than for teaching for life. And somehow their values are degenerate, so they end up maybe getting paid from a job but not fulfillment from the job, because they do not see other human beings who are less fortunate than them in a sufficient perspective. That's what I mean by that.
When you are talking about perspective, when you say that our society, quotes, has failed, don't you feel some sense of a historical obligation to relate a failure to a trend, if in fact the same percentage of Americans were to continue undernourished today as, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, then you could say it has failed, i.e. it is not improving. But isn't it difficult to say that about a society that shows the kind of economic movement that our own does show?
Well, I think that what one must be sensitive to is the relationship between the improvement of the country and the agitation by the persons who are rejected and called bad names until actually that they agitate about comes into law. For example, America is making a great move now, apparently, toward peace at some levels in Southeast Asia, but one cannot see that apart from the demonstrations and the jailings and the other persons who made the war unpopular and almost unpolitical. One can see progress made in the level of public accommodations. But one cannot see the public accommodations bill, which moves towards some universal respect for one's person in America, apart from the jailings and the bombings in Birmingham, Alabama, and the assassination. One can say we're making progress in the area of participatory democracy in terms of political involvement, but one cannot separate that from being subjected to the kind of beatings and lynching that took place in Alabama and Mississippi. So indeed there is progress, but it is in proportion to the agitation. And I think to that extent, some of the agitators need to be held as the vanguards for necessary change in the country, as opposed to being seen as some villains who should be locked up, killed, or sent to another country as a solution for their grievance, because the grievances, for the most part, are legitimate.
Well, but in fact, Mr. Jackson, and incidentally, I compliment you for having, quite a few minutes ago, skewered the superstition that it is only black people in America who want As we know, the figures show that there are 3 times as many white people numerically as black people who live in houses that are considered to be below the standard that we consider to be acceptable.
But numerically, there are 9 times as many white people as there are blacks.
I know. I say, you know, the percentages show that a higher percentage of blacks than whites, but
and numerically more whites than blacks.
That's right. Therefore, the argument, and this is widely used, that it is exclusively the blacks who are victimized in this country tends to break down under that kind of analysis. But I would like to ask you this.
Just a second. See, I think the problem in that area is that we're trapped on the double burden, you see, of class and caste. You see, we have a number of blacks who cannot move economically just because of their skin color. And you have other blacks who cannot move because of the way how goods and services are distributed in the country. And to that extent, one continues to hear the cries of racism in the country because a black person still has to be seen in terms of his adjective, which is his skin color, rather than his noun, his very person, his very being. A black person cannot really be seen within the context of this country as a subject, but only as an adjective, some black. To that extent, one has to categorize, the Ralph Bunches and the other great minds who have been able to break up through the muck and through the mire of things. And the general American population gets the impression that there's just one Ralph Bunche in a lifetime who has the genius to deal at the international level. And the fact is, if blacks were able to function on more objective conditions, in one sense as they are in athletics now, blacks have the same potential to participate vigorously in academics and in law and in politics and in international affairs as they do in athletics and in entertainment. And I think that the real issue of freedom is raised when one cannot realize his potential because his growth is inhibited by something, by some phenomenon such as color.
Well, I think what you're saying is that there has been and continues to be a certain amount of discrimination in America, and I agree. This is what
Based
we're
on
here
race.
to talk about. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. Now, how do you account for the fact that over the past 50 years, the economic progress seems to appear on a graph on a pretty straight line? That is to say, the poverty levels between 1900 and 1910 decreased about the same rate they did between 10 and 20, 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40, 50, 50, 60, when a moment ago you seemed to tie that progress into the kind of exertion in which you have been so conspicuous. Could it be that the progress that we're making is primarily not the result of rhetoric or fustian, but is the result of a very, very careful investment of savings and of a commitment to a kind of free economy that actually creates a certain residue, which in turn is redistributed?
Well, I never said that the progress we've made has been as a result of rhetoric.
Oh, Lord.
What I call vigorous agitation and direct action. Whether the direct action to protect black people in the 10 to 20 era was a result of the civil rights movement led at that time by the NAACP and Dr. Du Bois and that crowd, or whether in from the teens to up to about 1930, where you begin to have a great deal of movement toward organized labor, or when the whole country went bust, as it were, in the late 20s and early 30s, and the whole country had to begin to reassume a new economic posture. A lot of emergency relief acts came into existence, one of them, of course, being the welfare system. Now, when black folks are unemployed in large numbers, the way the press usually plays it, and I say the press because they're great image makers, they in one sense determine how people react to things. When large numbers of black folk are unemployed, high as 35 and 40% in several areas I know across this country today, they're referred to in terms such as lazy and apathetic. When large numbers of
What press are you talking about?
The major American white press.
Have you ever seen lazy and apathetic applied to the black unemployed in
Oh, yes.
Time magazine, Newsweek, New York Times, Chicago Tribune? Just, I'm curious where you've seen those.
At this point in time, if I were to answer it precisely, I would be libelous, and I don't choose to. but the general understanding of the characterization of black folks as lazy and apathetic, whether it's a study by some so-called group of social scientists or whatever, when we're in questions of should the family unit can the family unit in the black community stay together, and you know, some others, do we have the biological capacity to be civilized? All kind of, I consider, rather dumb questions. Or rather, they're great questions to be raised, but there are always adequate answers for them. But the fact is, as these questions were being raised and the general depression hit, then whites were referred not as lazy and apathetic, but it says an economic depression. Even the last so-called recession depression we had a few months ago, when large numbers of whites are unemployed, there's a certain sympathy that can be galvanized by political forces in the country that cannot be sympathized for the same number of blacks. As late as 1960, it was the tear-jerking of John Kennedy after coming from a tour of the Appalachian white poor that brought in the War on Poverty program as a stimulus, as opposed to his having gone to Harlem, seeing black folks in the same kind of condition. But those are just factors that we have to deal with in a racist society.
Your history is a little shaky. The War on Poverty was 1964. The Appalachian Relief Bill was a particular measure passed in 1961.
But the point is, the whole stimulus to move in that direction, we got to find relief for poor whites. The coal mines are closing up. What can we do for them? That whole notion grew out of being able to say, isn't it sad that white people are in trouble? And when you make an emergency relief act, a lot of black folk who are in that same economic class benefit from it as a product, as a byproduct, but not in a very direct kind of way. And I think that to that extent, that the economic circumstances of the country, more than forthright leadership, has the American economy in such shape as it is in now, good or bad. You cannot, to me, divorce such humanity as there is and such protection as there is for the American worker now, apart from a vigorous labor movement. In other words, for every good effect in the country, there has been some cause that has inspired that change.
Well, how do you analyze the notorious exclusion of blacks by many of the construction trades unions in this country? This is something that you would like to see reformed, I assume, correct?
Yes. I analyze it at two levels. One level is race and one level is economic. Mm-hmm. Is race to the extent that once, you know, blacks were considered great tradesmen in this country, carpenters and artisans and brick masons and stuff. And then the special effort schools that had been provided for us to break away from the bonds of slavery by being economically productive, those schools were either closed down or we were locked out of the white schools. And so without apparatus going to be able to build, we were only trapped with the ability to destroy. So in some sense, we got knocked out of that. And once these companies unionized, they simply, based upon skin color, locked us out. Now, it's significant to deal with the fact that they locked us out, because if we were not in, because we were lazy and apathetic and not concerned about working, that would appear to me to be an indictment upon the race. But if we are locked out in spite of our trials because of our skin color, then one can rather objectively call that racism. At that level is racism. Another level, the insecurity is fed by the uncertainty that workers have about the American economy. That is, when there was going to be a great construction clash here in Chicago, the poor whites were willing to shoot some blacks in order to keep their construction jobs. And some blacks were willing to shoot some whites in order to get some construction jobs. Now, here were two elements of folks in the white and black caste who are willing to die in order to live, which is no different from what people, I gather, doing in wherever war takes place. The answer to that issue was not for the blacks to eliminate the whites to eliminate the blacks, but to expand the economy in such a way until both could have enough security not to feel threatened by the presence of the other. So to that extent, that's what I would see as an answer, given the fact that the American cities have deteriorated and need to be built up. There's a great need for building to go on in America right now. There's no reason why there should be anybody on the street who desires to work unemployed.
Well, now, if it were demonstrated to your satisfaction that restrictive trade union practices that give them monopoly privileges actually result in an increase in unemployment, would it then follow that you would be in favor of legislation that would deprive them of those monopoly privileges?
Say that again, I don't understand that.
Well, if you were satisfied by somebody who demonstrated to you that the labor unions here and there, by the exercise of their right to exclude members and by their insistence that you join the union before you can practice your trade, actually cause unemployment, would you then say that a true reformer would be a man who came out for the repeal of those special privileges of the labor unions?
I think that whatever it is that allows labor unions to be able to exclude other people within the context of the American citizenry based on race, those privileges should be taken. On the other hand, whatever it is about labor union that allows them to protect themselves from being dominated and suppressed by management without any respect for the average worker, then that ought to be retained. So in some sense, one would need to take the best elements of both.
Right. Well, do you believe in the right of the individual to a job, irrespective of whether he joins a labor union?
Oh, yes.
Do.
Oh, absolutely.
So you believe in right-to-work laws?
Well, I think that, see, the problem is that the right-to-work clause is a funny kind of concept, because when I say right-to-work, it doesn't quite mean the same thing as right-to-work laws, because right-to-work laws almost mean not the right to work. See, it sounds very backwards to people. I believe that a person has, I think the government has an obligation to provide an economy, provided it has the resources that would allow a person to be gainfully employed so as to have a job or an income. I think that the individual should have, you know, the maximum opportunity to express himself and should have the freedom to join or to not join a union. One should have the freedom to deal with his choice of unions.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Well, now let me just, before we go to the panel...
You agree with me on that?
Yes, I do. I agree with you 100%. In fact, I haven't disagreed with anything you said so far. Let me ask you then this, finally, Ms. Jackson, to what extent do you feel, as a member of a minority group carefully qualified along the lines of your well-stated qualifications a few moments ago, to what extent do you feel a psychic necessity to defend behavior by somebody who is black that might be considered outrageous if viewed detachedly? To what extent do you feel, in other words, that it is one of your responsibilities as a black leader to refuse to get angry at, say, some of the rhetoric of, let's say, a Black Panther leader or whatever? Or do you simply feel, I can't let anybody see that I'm critical of this because it would tend to cause a disunity, and what is most important at this point is a unified black minority movement? Well,
you know, I feel an obligation to analyze things as objectively as I can, and call shots as I see them.
Privately or publicly also?
No, I can do it both, you see. However, I believe that civilized people can have the capacity to disagree without being disagreeable. I think that people can have relationships where if they agree on 6 things out of 10, not 9 out of 10, but 6 things out of 10, the fact that they're batting 600 means they still can have a pretty sound relationship. Furthermore, however, I feel that the unity of black folk within the context of the society is of such until, if it means absolving some rhetoric and some rapping in order to stay on the issue, then we have to do that. I think that if I have a blatant disagreement with a person who represents a national organization within the context of the black community, that I would go to the person privately first and discuss the disagreement.
Not publicly.
Rather than blast the person across the airwaves so as to give, so as to increase the disparagement and the sense of despair at some levels that already exists within the context of the community. What binds us is our skin color and our history and our heritage and our circumstance and our experience. And those binds are so profound until different ways of expressing the same phenomenon are not strong enough to break up those facts. And those are the facts out of which we must actually function, that we do not at one level have the luxury to be divided about things minor.
Right, good point. Therefore, for so long as you feel bound to one another primarily by the factor of race, you acknowledge that you have not achieved the kind of equality that you seek. The kind of equality that I understand people ought to aspire to is an equality that allows you to criticize somebody irrespective of the color of his skin. If you feel that there is an innate immunity that I, as a Catholic, let's say, have to extend to somebody else because he's a Catholic, then there is something working to cause a synthetic allegiance between us, which is an aspect of the fact of our being oppressed.
Well, at this
now,
point,
at some point, can't we all hope that the black minority will graduate to the point where you can, with all candor and with all self-assurance, criticize the excesses of people, even if their skin is black?
well, if I'm living in America long enough for that day to arrive,
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah, well, there's certainly nothing right now but hope.
Yeah.
You know, frankly.
No, we said the statistics were very reassuring.
Yeah,
so
frankly,
there's more than just hope.
Frankly, at this point, I make decisions. You know, you got one of three categories as I see it: race, sex, or ideas. And I would not demean a person because of his race, white or black. And I would not demean a person's brain and one's right to participate because she's female. I tend to gravitate more to ideas. You see, at this point, I'm more caught up in moving toward solutions to our economic crisis than I am in arguing about who best states our pain. You see, in one sense, it doesn't make sense to try to attach a value judgment to the pain, to those who describe the pain. You know, Hewitt describes the pain and the agony one way, and Roy Wilkins describes it another way, and Ralph Abernathy describes it another way, and Julian Bond describes it another way. And all of us are really expressing the pain and the agony. And at some levels, because sometimes solutions do not appear to be forthcoming, sometimes expressions of pain can grow into statements and expressions of frustration. But nonetheless, we have to spend most of our time still fighting for a transcendent perspective that would move us toward a solution to the problem. As I see it, the problem for us is essentially economic. And if the problem is economic, then the solution is economic. And to that extent, we need to begin to start looking at economic alternatives as opposed to organizational alternatives.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, and I've been saying that quite fervently for 10 years. But it's also true that one needs good nature, one needs mutual respect. One needs some faith in the good offices of other people. Now, it seems to me that it is a clear obligation on the part of leading white Southern citizens to denounce, for instance, people whose rhetoric appeals to the Ku Klux Klan. And I say this not only for philosophical reasons, not only for ethical reasons, but also for economic reasons, because the kind of hatred that is stirred up by that kind of an exercise of the emotions, among other things, has economic effects. I don't need to trace them out to you. By the same token, it seems to me that it is plainly the responsibility of black leaders to denounce the counterparts of the Ku Klux Klan when they show up with black skins, and that occasionally in the rhetoric of anti-discrimination, with which I thoroughly sympathize, where references are continually made to black skins, all of a sudden one finds that these people are pleading exemptions for people just because they have black skins.
You know, I somehow get the impression that you are setting up some parallel between the Ku Klux Klan and the Panthers, which I disagree with. In that the acute difference is that, you know, you know, assuming both groups have admitted publicly that they don't mind killing for what they believe in, the Ku Klux Klan is willing to kill people to resist change. Panthers are willing to kill in order for change to come about. In some sense...
No, the first killings of the Ku Klux Klan were to encourage change away from the politics of the Restoration right after the Civil War.
That's right.
So in that sense, they were, quotes, progressive, if you like, i.e., they were the revolutionaries.
That's right. They were progressively backwards.
That's right.
Which is...
Which is perfectly possible.
They were progressive, but the direction was
right.
one that was inhumane in terms of the broader participation of human beings. Now, when you talk about should one be willing to do whatever is necessary to stop an outside force from occupying his community, whether it's an exploiting store owner, or whether it's an absentee landlord, or whether it's an absentee police force that exists in the community every day, if one is willing to do whatever one has to do to break this up, I see this as qualitatively different
That's a little tricky, Mr. Jackson.
than the Night Riders.
That's a little tricky. Because if I want to talk about the Ku Klux Klan the way you've just talked about the Panthers, I would say, if you want to criticize somebody for defending the constitutional rights of people in the South, this is what the Ku Klux Klan people think they're doing. But you and I are both sophisticated enough and have heard enough of the rhetoric of the Black Panthers to know that this isn't what it's all about.
No, but
one has only to read the works of Mr. Cleaver or see see the front page of the Black Panther newspaper the day after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, where they have him lying like a pig in his own blood. You see his face transformed at the likeness of a pig. This is what I consider to be the essential Black Panther approach.
But see, you know, interestingly enough, Buckley, one who is not hurting cannot very well tell one who is how to holler. When one is hurting and expressing his pain, his agony, it may come out in sounds, most of which will not be muted. A lot of the sounds will be unpleasant. But a lot of times, if one will hear the message as opposed to reacting to the words, one can begin to move to the root cause of the pain and the basic rejection. In other words, what you're talking about when one looks at the general generation out of which now has pantherized young Black America, you're talking about a group of young people who are the children of parents whose hopes and dreams have been blasted. You're talking about young people who do not have confidence in the country, that apparently cannot even gather the confidence of the children of its own leadership. So in some sense, the Panthers are following and relating to the children of those who are now in power. So in one sense, you see the Panthers and the rich young white Americans are in one school of thought, your children. And the Ku Klux Klan are in another school of thought. And I don't think one should draw a parallel.
The trouble with that kind of analysis, that kind of a gloss, which is very persuasive, is that sure, it's very persuasive. It was used by Hitler, and it's used by anybody to defend anything by simply pointing to a historical hurt. In point of fact, it's not true, by the way, apart from being persuasive. The man who cured syphilis didn't suffer from it.
Are you raising the question of my integrity and my judgment?
It was most clearly your judgment historically. It seems to me that nothing is plainer than that throughout history. People have said, you are a wounded people, and under the circumstances you're entitled to rearm, and you're entitled to take back this territory in France that was taken from you as a result of the betrayal in the war, and so on and so forth.
Now the question is, Buckley, do you react to them and their words of anger and their expressions of pain, trying to prove them to be historically wrong or historically inaccurate, or do you begin to react to the problem with a solution? See, that's what we need to discuss.
You should do both.
See, you're talking about...
Why can't you do both?
Well, you can do both, but the question is which one does one do first? In other words, if one is to deal with the whole question of a rotten tooth, and it's aching right now, you probably should ultimately pull the tooth, but right now you need some Novocaine. And Novocaine is evidence that somebody has some expression of a solution. Then one with the Novocaine and some cotton in the hollow can move on to it, getting the tooth
What's
pulled.
the equivalent of Novocaine to a Black Panther newspaper comparing Bobby Kennedy to a pig?
No, the issue is not even the newspaper. The issue is the expression of pain which grows out of a rejection of the country because the country has tended to disrespect our person. There must be some evidence that the country is moving toward, in fact, one judicial process for all people, and one educational process for all people, and one job and one housing market for all people, and one military draft system for all people.
I think that's evasive, but let's...
Well, that's basically, see, that is basically the rub. You see, a friend of mine just told me today about a young black group in a certain city. That group of black businessmen were trying to organize. And in this city, that a group of young black people were extorting stores. They were going around demanding or exacting $100 a week or whatever kind of dues they could get from the store owner. Now, you see, if they were in the white community, you see, they would be arrested by the police and they would be put in jail.
Or they'd get away with it. A lot of them get away with it.
No, just listen to what I'm saying. And no organized group of young blacks or young whites walking around publicly extorting white stores. Now, that's just not accurate. It's just not accurate. Secondly, is that the fact that the judicial process has broken down in the black community has at one level created a certain laxity of respect for even a certain level of civilized law, because you've allowed, the whole community has just been allowed to deteriorate and to degenerate. So what happened, these businessmen will either have to assume law in their own hands by killing these young blacks, or they will have to beg in an alien white police force to stop them. So the black community is caught in the bind. You know, how do you solve it? Well, the fact is, these young blacks are getting the money from the black store, but the answer is not for the black store merchant to kill the young man or the white police to kill him, but to begin to move toward a civilized state of economics where the young man can have a job or an income without having to rob or extort a store. And we know that's possible in that robbing stores is not an innate situation. That's a social situation.
Well, there are a lot of people who rob stores for non-economic reasons. I grant that the majority are in the other category, but there are some people do it as a perversion. But Mr. Hart.
Well, first of all, I'd just sort of like to point out how incredibly ironic I find that you, Mr. Buckley, takes a stand as a defender of Robert Kennedy here and now. I think it's more of a pragmatic stand than anything
If I may
else.
say so, I think that's rather fatuous. I defend him against the charge of being a pig. I don't defend him against those things for which I criticized him. But go ahead.
Perhaps hypocritical might have been a better phrase there. But to Reverend Jackson, not Mr. as you've been called throughout the program, how would you estimate that black political
Will you tell him
caucuses
that you asked me to call you Mr. before he's through with his next
Well, I'd just like to finish my question.
All right.
now.
All right, now, I called him Mr. because he asked me to, okay? And I think it was something else sarcastic to say.
Oh,
Don't
thanks so much.
intimidate the man, Buckley. He's just a student.
Well, he hasn't proved it quite yet.
Well, we're all niggers in front of Big Bill, I guess. How would you estimate that black political caucuses, such as the meeting of black political leaders, which took place recently here in Mayor Daley, Chicago, would come to fruition? And more importantly, how would you figure in vanguard groups such as Black Panthers into this political struggle?
Well, I think that what has happened in a series of meetings is that a group of political figures who in fact must help to inspire and to inform the black and the poor and the concerned population, those who are concerned about real change in '72, have begun to hold a series of meetings in order to deal with the question of strategy. What does one do for 1972 in the area of voter registration? Where are the target areas where improvement can be made? Who are the best candidates? Shall a black candidate run? To what extent shall one challenge either of the two parties to relate to black folk? I mean, the kind of questions that one would raise in the strategy. And certainly one shouldn't wait to 1972 to begin to raise those questions. In some sense, a lot of reporters said in 1960 it was the voter margin supplied by black folk. Really Chicago black folks giving away the votes when in 1960 it got President Kennedy in office. And he made some apparent reference to it once or twice by expressing thanks to, at that time, Congressman Bill Dawson. Now, all we got that time for being accused of making a president was a thank you and a warm poverty job here and there, mostly there. Now, in 1972, it's apparent that we have, if we vote, we have the political power to make or break another presidential candidate. If Nixon beat Humphrey by 550 to 600,000 votes, I having a rather definite position based upon the issues that we want resolved, we can determine rather accurately and objectively who we should support in 1972. So these meetings have been all about that. And I would assume that the Panthers and any other group that's concerned about the commonwealth, the basic commonwealth of black people, in particular and other people in general, would go along with such a strategy. I doubt very seriously if they would be opposed to that.
Ms. Wilson?
Okay. A couple of times you use the phrase civilized state of economy. And I, want you to define civilized and, where does that put the black man, in this particular state? And before I finish, where does that put us in our quest for freedom?
Okay. A civilized economy, and a successful one, incidentally, would be a job or an income to everybody that desires to work. Full employment economy would constitute to me a civilized and a successful economy. Furthermore, a civilized economy would provide a sufficient day's pay and sufficient provisions for the common worker, for those that do have jobs. You see, there of the 80 million or so workers in the country, only about 17 million are organized, and many of them are working, but they do not have protection as civilized people should operate to protect, each other's rights and each other's life. So as I said, you got 40 million people working. You got 40 million people listed as malnourished or really below the poverty line. And of that 40 million, 30 million live in a household where somebody's working every day. But the fact that they're working 8 and 10, 12 hours a day and they're still below the poverty level means that some uncivilized behavior is taking place and some real exploitation is taking place at some levels by some producers.
Why does it follow that exploitation is taking place?
Well, if a person engages in a day's work and does not get enough pay in that work to provide the basic necessities for his life, then somebody's exploiting his labor.
But by definition, if that person can't survive, this is, of course, the big technical fight of the 19th century on the labor theory of value, and it has pretty well been accepted that you can't pay less than a, quote, living wage, because even viewed purely mechanically.
Significant that you said that, because you see, uncivilized people talk about the minimum wage. Civilized people talk about a livable wage. And so to the extent that people are still arguing about minimum wage, arguing whether or not you're going to pay somebody $1.10 an hour or $1.15 an hour, when in fact the Labor Department and other fairly responsible groups have indicated about what a family of four needs. You see, for one to need in order to have his basic necessities dealt with, one to need, say, $7,000 a year.
No, you're talking about, well, I don't want to cheat Mr. Tracy out of his questions.
Just 1 second. Okay. So sister asked me 2 questions, and I thought it would be proper to answer.
Sure, go
Number
ahead.
1, she's late, and I don't want to get trapped in that. Number 2, she's a sister, and you know I got a complex about black people. The second question, I wish you would state again, because I had an answer. Brother Buckley threw me off a little bit.
Some people tend to think that when we reach, as you put, a civilized state of economy, that will put us near the end of our quest for freedom. And I just want to know where specifically did you relate?
Now you see, that gets into an interesting kind of braid concept called freedom. To me, freedom now has to be seen in economic terms, not just in social and psychological terms alone. For example, freedom in 1956 was to be able to sit on the front of the bus because that's where other people sat. It was to have choice. within the realm of public accommodations. And then freedom in 1965 became the right to vote. Since that time, freedom is becoming the right to survive or the right to live with an adequate, livable income. Now, to that extent, we have to begin to raise the question like, how much will freedom cost? And when Japan and Germany were raped and ripped as a result of war and other circumstances 25 years ago, they didn't send a war on poverty program to Japan. And they concluded that Japan and Germany as welfare states would cost the country too much money. So they developed an alternative to a welfare state, which was a national development program for them. They gave us emergency relief programs, gave them national development programs. So Germany gets a domestic Marshall Plan, and Japan gets capital investment, gets market incentives, and gets tax breaks in order to recover and to move toward being an independent economy, so to speak. Now here we are at this point in time, moving toward becoming a welfare state. And we have a choice, the nation has a choice. If we are to continue to go to the kind of schools that we go to, trapped in the kind of neighborhood that we're in, with no investment of monies coming there, we're going to become a welfare state and therefore a liability. However, if we are seen as an underdeveloped nation that in fact is worthy of being invested in, and the National Development Plan replaces the National Welfare Plan, we too can be able to contribute to the world economy just as Japan and Germany are about to do. And I think that racism, I say this in our close, has blinded the American economists and politicians even from having the sensitivity to appreciate the fact that, for example, in Chicago, the consumer market is something like $5 billion, larger than Puerto Rico, and the islands down through the Caribbean. And so there are people who, at this point in time, who are concerned about investing down in the islands, may need to invest in the south and west side and the north side Chicago. Nationally, we have a $45 billion a year.
You got 15 seconds, Mr. Jackson.
Economy. You understand? Which is greater than Japan or Germany had. And the question is, shall we develop an intra-national trade agreement with black America, or shall we keep on moving toward a welfare state? That's a major question.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Sorry, Mr. Tracy, another day. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel, thank you.
For a printed copy of this program, send 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. That address again, Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.